Hello, greetings everyone. It's so good for all of you to join us here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. I also wanted to wish a happy Ramadan to those of you who are celebrating this holy month. Just a very quick note that we have been fortunate enough to be able to provide simultaneous translation for this event from English to Bengali. So please, at the bottom of your Zoom, you will be able to pick the language that you're interested in. So you got to pick one or the other. So if you would like to have simultaneous translation in Bengali, please pick Bengali. If you like it to have it in English, please pick the channel English. The other channel is not recommended. So just pick one or the other so that we can keep everything streamlined. Okay, without further ado, I will go ahead and welcome everyone. My name is Mona Tajali. I'm a scholar of gender and politics based at University, as well as I am an executive board member of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network. Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which for short we call it WALUM, is an international solidarity network that provides information, support, and a collective space for women whose lives are shaped, conditioned, or governed by laws and customs set to drive from Islam. Its work is grounded in informed activism and research for action, linking knowledge production with advocacy and grassroots mobilization. Last year in 2025, actually, Walloon marked its 40th year anniversary. The network was officially founded in 1985 by a group of women from diverse Muslim contexts, among them my own colleague, Hama Hutfar here, who you will hear from in just a bit. At that time, she was just a graduate student. But the main intention was to really bring about this transnational feminist solidarity at a time when Islamic fundamentalist movements were intensifying their attacks on women's rights as well as gender equality. So from Iran to Pakistan to Egypt to beyond, women were confronting these coordinated efforts to curtail their freedoms and roll back hard-won rights. For more than 4 decades, Walum has worked to really build this transnational feminist solidarity grounded in understanding that attacks on gender equality and the erosion of women's rights never occur in isolation. While we do see that there's transnational waves of authoritarianism and anti-feminist backlash, at the same time, we do know that these transnational sort of right-wing waves do demand an equally transnational feminist response, one rooted in solidarity, shared knowledge, as well as collective resistance. This is the rationale for this space and why we're here today. Despite decades of hard feminist work on women's political rights and roles, including in elected office, we are unfortunately witnessing a backlash against such gains in various parts of the globe, especially in Muslim countries such as Iran, in Bangladesh, in Syria, and more. Just for instance, about 2 weeks ago, we saw the results of an orchestrated misogynist attack on women candidates and politicians in Bangladesh that contributed to a notable decrease in women's parliamentary presence in more than 2 decades. So just last election, we only had 4% of the total candidates be women in Bangladesh. And only 7 women were directly elected to the parliament. Nearly all of them were from the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, and Bangladesh does have 50 reserved seats, which women tried to increase, but unfortunately that was not possible. So for the first time, the rate of women's parliamentary presence, in addition to the counting also the reserved seats, will be only at 16%, which is the drop of at least 20%, which has been for the past 2 decades. And as well, next week on March 3rd, Walloon and Stanford are organizing a virtual webinar on tech-facilitated gender-based violence during moments of transition and conflict. This one as well will feature key advocates on women's political representation. Please follow our social media for more details. So I will now give the floor to my colleague Homa Hutfar, who would just like to sort of base us in what we're talking about a little bit today.
Yes, hello to everyone. I just wanted to add to what Mona has said, to say that Walloon was created actually as a result of the attack on a backlash women were experiencing in the 70s. So in the early 80s, we got together. These backlashes happened with the Iranian Revolution, with Western governments supporting a reactionary group of the very extreme Islamist group in order to defeat the Russian in the Afghan wars. And then, of course, it spread to the rest of the Middle East. So we realized that at that time, with women being absent from most spaces, political spaces, then and so the laws are made by men without women being there. And so we got together and realized also that a lot of similar things are happening in different places, but each is justified differently. So we set up a cross-cultural, cross-border research looking at women and politics and women and laws, and came together in that way, build the solidarity based on experiences and sharing experiences. With that also, we then joined the feminist in 1985. We joined the transnational feminist movement. Together with work with them, we then put a lot of lobbying and pressure on UN to make women in politics part of the UN agenda. In 1992, this resulted in the 30% quota for in Beijing, which then in 2000 because a lot of us came from the military political background, we had a lot of pressure to make women in peace a reality, because you can't have politics without, if you don't have peace isn't part of the politics. So that way, in a way, Wulum has been part of this movement of trying to bring women to the political spaces so that they can share and decide about themselves. Of course, that kind of a background resulted in a lot of the later debate, which Mona Krook has been a major part of that, to build the parity debates. And I wanted to say that parity debates are very important, especially if you look at, for instance, Tunisia, that has been in 2014 has been one of the countries, Muslim majority countries, with more women in the parliament, from the 31%. Now the last election in 2024, it was only 15%. Iranian have never came to more than 5.7%. This is 2016, there are even less now. Similar reduction is happening. And of course, Mona explained right now what happened in Bangladesh. And for those of you who may not be familiar, apart from all the issues that Mona said, Bangladeshis women have been trying to change this quota, which is parliamentary political parties choose the women, to make that direct election, because that will then women MPs would be responsible to their constituency, not to the political parties. But the political parties, especially the two big political parties, resented that and prevented that to happen. And in the last parliamentary election that Mona just mentioned, we had only 7 women directly elected. Out of the last election was 22, and unfortunately, out of 49 ministers, now we have only 3 positions given to women, which is used to be 8. And then sadly, even women and children's affairs usually goes to women. In this case, has gone to men. So you can see we have a long debate to go. So what I wanted to say in short is parity to me is not a luxury. It is necessary for us if we want to reach a democratic party, and also it is the roadmap to get there is transnational solidarity, because these things doesn't happen, as we know about. We notice with the gender quotas, countries learn from one another and women learn from each other, and we do need to work together in order to make parity a reality. And of course, we can then listen to Mona to give us more detail on that. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'm looking forward to hear Mona on that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Homajan. And yes, just just add to that that as part of this sort of this backlash that we're seeing that takes place, particularly within the conservative context, we're also seeing that women's rights advocates who have been pushing for more gender equal representations are also the ones who are facing extensive amounts of intimidation and harassment. Neri Poco is one of our partners in Bangladesh, which is a long-lasting sort of women's rights organization. And in fact, this event was born out of those conversations as well, because there was efforts towards gender parity pushed by them, but then there was just too much attacks that in fact now we see the results of it. I can say the same thing that's happening in the country of Iran, where both Homa and I are from, as well as of course in Afghanistan. We see the rise of the Taliban. Completely eradicating women's political force. I think the whole purpose of us is recognizing that these are not necessarily isolated cases. When you have the success of the right wing movements in such instances, it does amplify and it does empower other right wing conservative forces to also follow suit, right? So I think this is the moment where we really need to be as much orchestrated as possible in our push for more gender parity. I will now just give a very, very brief introduction to Professor Mona Lena Krook. There's no way I can do justice to the amount of work that you have done for the past few decades, but I will try my best to give you a very, very brief summary. Thankfully, Professor Krook has a really nice website that you can just go to and visit all of her accomplishments. So yes, it's my honor to introduce her. She's a leading and world-renowned scholar, practitioner, and award-winning author on gender and politics. Professor Krook is currently the Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Women and Politics PhD program at Rutgers University. She earned her PhD in political science from Columbia University, where her award-winning dissertation examined global campaigns for candidate gender quotas, a work that helps shape an entire field of research. That work served actually as a great inspiration for many other bodies of research, including my own, as well as the work of women living under Muslim laws, when we recognize that the level of grassroots demands for such measures really do exist across Muslim contexts. Since her graduate school years, Professor Krook has been devoted to the questions of how to elect more women to positions of political power, how to reduce barriers that keep women out of politics, such as the waves of violence against women in politics, and how to pursue democratic politics through gender parity, which is the subject of today's talk. While no introduction can fully capture the impact of her work, including her many award-winning publications, I just wanted to highlight a few of her books. I also want to underscore something especially meaningful about her work. It is that it's deeply cumulative. Each major project builds on the last, with new questions emerging from earlier findings while engaging the same core issues. So for graduate students in the room, I think this is a really important model, that her career demonstrates that it is possible to devote time to a single set of questions, refining them, expanding them, and deepening them while continuing to produce innovative field-shaping research. So Professor Krook's first book is Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, published by Oxford University Press. And her groundbreaking 2020 book is Violence Against Women in Politics, which was also published by Oxford University Press. She's also authored numerous articles, many of which have become foundational readings for those of us who teach on women and politics. And I assign her readings all the time. Beyond academia, so Professor Krook has also been considered a practitioner, so really bridging that divide between academia and practitioner worlds. She has worked closely with international organizations, civil society groups, and governments around the world to design strategies to elect more women and to combat violence against women in political life. For instance, she collaborated with the National Democratic Institute on Not the Cost campaign, which was a campaign on addressing violence against women in politics. She's also served as a consultant for a variety of civil society organizations, governments, and international bodies, including in Asia, Latin America, as well as the Middle East. Today, we're here to discuss her latest book, Elect Women for a Change, The Path to Gender Parity in Politics, which was published just days ago by Wiley. The book brings together decades of Professor Krook's research and real-world experience to chart a clear and actionable path toward achieving gender parity in political leadership. We're so thrilled to have you. Professor Krook, I'm going to give you the floor. Please feel free to hold on to your questions for Professor Krook. You're more than welcome to then post your questions into the chat. in whatever language you wish, in Farsi, Dari, in Bengali, or in English. Those are the ones that we are able to manage. And then we'll be able to definitely open the floor after her talk. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just share my screen. Sorry, I'm just sorry, I had it all set up here. Okay. Um, okay, well, thank you so much. That was a really lovely introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me and for everyone for coming to talk about this book that really has come to mean a lot to me because it really kind of encapsulates in one place all of the ideas and insights that I've had over the last 25 years of working on these issues and thinking about how to promote the equal representation of women and men in politics. And just to let you know, I created a website for the book, so there's just a link there in case you want to know more about what's in the different parts of the book. Um, so the starting point of the book and of my talk today is the dramatic shifts that we have seen over the last 30 years in the political representation of women across the globe. So you see here that in every region of the world, the share of women in national parliaments has doubled or even tripled in this very short span of time. And this is just looking at the average. If we look at the individual country level, there are even more dramatic changes in some cases. Today, there are 6 states that have elected 50% or more women to parliament, and nearly 30 have elected 40% or more. This is a huge change. In 1995, there was only one country that had more than 40% women in parliament, and that was Sweden. At the same time, you can also see that even though there's been progress, it falls short of parity, right? So in Latin America, there's average about 35% women in parliament across the region, and that stands out across all the regions of the world. So the book really tries to understand how do we go from here, right? We've made a lot of progress, but there's still more to do. So my own career has kind of been part of this journey. I started graduate school in 1998, really just as these patterns were starting to change in the wake of the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, which was held in Beijing in 1995. And the Beijing conference produced the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. It identified 12 strategic areas of priority, and one of them was women in power and decision making. So the two topics that I've studied, which Mona has already mentioned, have been electoral gender quotas and violence against women in politics. Um, and quotas really have been the main driver of these changes that we've seen in the changes, increases in the share of women elected to political office around the world. And these are measures that have been adopted either at the national level or the political party level to require a certain share of women to be nominated as candidates or to be elected to political office. So in this first book, which I published in 2009, it maps the rapid diffusion of gender quotas around the world. At that time, there were about 100 countries that had adopted quotas, most of them since 1995. I would say like 80 or 90% of those countries since 1995. And that project really was interested in how quotas were designed, how they came to be adopted, and what explained variations in their effects on the numbers of women actually elected. So my second book, which was published in 2020, emerged out of that work as I was trying to understand the broader impact of quotas, for example, in terms of what they meant for the broader acceptance of women as leaders. And in that work, I was really expecting to hear mainly positive stories of transformation, which I did, right? Women shared how they had, been able to mobilize for new policies and laws to advance women's rights. There had been changes in how people thought about women leaders, right? There was greater acceptability and even broader measures of gender equality in society. But I also heard at the same time, in talking to political women around the world, um, some more troubling stories of backlash, things like, violence, harassment, abuse, that really seemed aimed at trying to get women to leave politics. Right. So we spent all those years trying to get women in. And then once they got in, right, there have been efforts to kind of push them back out. And so that was a project I worked on for about 5, 6 years, really trying to understand this issue and to work with practitioners on this question. So in 2016, we launched the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics with the National Democratic Institute. And that was great because it really was a full collaboration of academics and practitioners to think about what this issue was and what we could do about it. So my current book really tries to bring these two pieces together at the same time as kind of try to bring in things that maybe haven't appeared in some of my published work, my academic work, which is the work that I've done with practitioners on efforts to, for example, promote gender quotas, right? So in Japan and Chile, Vietnam, work that I've done to try to recognize and combat violence against women in politics, so work on the Not the Cost campaign, as well as with UN Women to try to develop indicators for measuring violence against women in politics. And most recently, last week, I was at a conference with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where they've developed a toolkit. And the latest toolkit is about how individual politicians kind of come up with coping strategies at the individual level, right? In the face of the lack of institutional mechanisms to do this. And then lastly, some work that I've been doing to develop the normative case for gender balanced decision making with the CEDAW committee, as well as with the Interparliamentary Union. And so I spent about 2 years working with the UN CEDAW committee on General Recommendation number 40 on the equal and inclusive representation of women in decision-making systems. Very long title, but really provides the main legal normative framework we have at the international level to support the case for gender parity in politics, but also outside politics as well. So from this combination of perspectives, the book is trying to really advance this growing global movement for gender parity. In the last few years, we've seen UN member states agree unanimously to the goal of 50-50 representation. That's in the 2021 agreed conclusions to the Commission on the Status of Women meetings. We've also seen, as I mentioned, a new general recommendation from the CEDAW committee arguing that governments are obliged to promote equal and inclusive decision-making as part of signing up to signing and ratifying the CEDAW Convention. And then we have a declaration by women parliamentarians last year, women across the globe calling for gender parity. At the national level, we've also seen a growing number of countries adopting parity laws. The first was France in 2000, but similar laws have now spread across many parts of Latin America in particular. We've also seen states, primarily in Western Europe, adopt provisions for what I would call flexible parity. So if strict parity is 50-50, flexible parity is 60-40, so no fewer than 40% or no more than 60% of either sex as candidates or as elected officials. But all this together really shows us there have been these changes. There's this growing momentum at the international level, but also the national level to make parity a reality. So this book is really about how do we spread this even further, right? And deepen the commitments to parity that we already have. So this is just an overview of what's in the book more generally, and I'll just talk about certain parts of it in this talk. But the first chapter really just starts with the overview of the global parity movement, the latest international frameworks in support of this goal. And then I talk about what parity is, right? We can't mobilize for it if we don't understand what it is. And I argue that we need to think about it as being about more than numbers. It also has to be about access, power, and diversity. Then talk about some of the benefits of parity and argue that it can help us advance equality and human rights, promote qualified and diligent politicians, foster more responsive public policy, increase democratic legitimacy, and encourage gender equality in other spheres. I also tried to explain why we don't yet have parity, if it's such a great thing, focusing on the three barriers of socialization, discrimination, and backlash. And then I have a chapter that outlines strategies used globally to counteract those three barriers. And it ends with a global call to action, arguing that everyone, I think, can do something to advance parity, right? So I'm hoping that people who read the book will find something useful, some way that they can also contribute to these efforts. So across the chapters, the book makes four main arguments, which I'll just summarize here. First, parity is about more than numbers. This is really the easiest way to capture progress, the main way that we do that. But I want to argue that numbers do not capture the full picture. Second, that parity is not a panacea. It has clearly identifiable benefits, but we can't expect it to solve all the world's problems. And we don't want to put that burden on parity itself. Third, patriarchy undermines parity because gender inequality is infused into all of our social and political structures. And so that creates ongoing resistance to any efforts to change the status quo, right? So we're not working with a blank slate, right? We're working in this space of resistance and pushback the entire time, and we need to keep that in mind. And lastly, and because of that, parity requires action, right? You often see people say, well, at the rate of progress, in 200 years, we'll have parity. No, it's going to take longer than 200 years if we don't do something now, right? And this is really, I would just say I spent many years studying women in Scandinavian politics, right? And people would often say, well, those countries are just very gender equal. No, they got that way because women mobilized, right? They have been mobilizing for decades to try to change the status quo. So even in countries that you would think like maybe they are already less patriarchal, it got that way because of deliberate action. And so I want to give people tools for trying to take that take that action, and to call for any sort of deliberate intervention that could be developed to advance this goal. So obviously I don't have time to go into all of these in great detail. I'm just going to talk a bit about these three chapters that I've bolded here in green, focusing on what parity is, how we can what are the forms of resistance, and then finally how we can get to parity in practice. Okay, so to elaborate how I'm thinking about gender parity in politics, I argue in the book that parity has three important, interrelated, and non-negotiable components. Right? First, women and men have to have equal access to political office, both elected and appointed. Second, women and men must have equal power in politics, measured in terms of leadership and influence. And third, women and men must be represented in their full diversity. And that's going to vary across countries, but could include, variations by religion, race, age, sexuality, disability, among other possibilities. So what this definition stresses, in other words, is that the demand for 50-50 representation falls short if it does not also prioritize meaningful and inclusive participation. So we need parity at all three of those dimensions, and without one, we're not looking at a case of gender parity. There's more that we need to do to achieve it. All right, so just to say a little bit more, how do we measure these things, right? Equal access is the question of numbers, 50-50 representation. At the global level, this is the most commonly used measure of women's political empowerment. Since the 1990s, the Interparliamentary Union, which is the global organization of parliaments, has been collecting this data, and it ranks countries according to their levels of representation. And this is data that's also used by other actors like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum in global gender equality rankings. So it's always like the measure of women's empowerment in those ranking that you see published every year. In the US, we have the Center for American Women in Politics at my university, which also does this for the United States. But the main global source of data is the Interparliamentary Union. So here's just an example of one of these rankings. It's from a map that the Interparliamentary Union and UN Women put out together every year. And you can kind of see how countries align. So this is just the top of the list, countries with 50% or more and countries with 40% or more. And so one of the things I think might stand out to you is that many of the countries at the top of this list, right? So Rwanda, Cuba, United Arab Emirates, they're not democracies, right? And this is because there are a lot of authoritarian regimes globally who are engaging in what some of my colleagues call autocratic gender washing, right? So they use their high numbers of women in politics to try to portray their governments as more democratic than they actually are, right? So that's just one example amongst many, but it shows us that numbers can tell us something, but they can also be misleading in terms of, if that's the main thing we're talking about, gender parity. That doesn't quite capture, I think, what we want to think about this concept. Okay, so numbers are important, but they're not enough. If you look at equal power as a second dimension, I think we could measure this in terms of leadership and influence. One of the things that we often see in politics is that women are elected, but then they don't get the same chances as men to take up leadership positions. So, for example, as heads of legislative committees, right? So committees in parliament, they're not like the president or the co-president. And these kinds of positions are important because they allow a person to direct the political agenda, right? So it's not just about getting women into the rank and file, right? But they should also be at these sort of top leadership spaces as well. We also see that women and men in politics are often pushed into different kinds of policy work, usually along gendered lines. So this is again from the same map from the Interparliamentary Union and UN Women, which looks at the share of women cabinet ministers by different types of portfolio, right? So you can see that almost all ministries of women and gender equality are held by women, all followed by family and children affairs and social inclusion and development. Right? So these are portfolios that are kind of linked to women's traditional roles in society. In contrast, women rarely hold portfolios on topics like religion, energy, transportation, defense, right? And so even though I would say, portfolios like gender equality and social inclusion are very important, what parity means to me is the fact that women and men have the same chances to have a voice in all policy areas, right? So women should be able to say something about agriculture or finance, right? Foreign affairs, at the same time that men should also be involved in discussions on human rights, for example. Right. So for me, parity is that both men and women are kind of equally, distributed and having a voice across all of these areas. The third dimension is diversity, which we can measure in terms of other aspects of representatives' personal backgrounds. So on average, globally, women constitute around 27% of all members of parliament worldwide. But if we look at who these women are, we see that they tend to be from dominant ethnic groups. For example, they tend to be middle-aged or older, and they tend to enjoy a privileged position in terms of their social class. At the same time, within those groups, men also tend to far and outnumber women. So if you're looking at young representatives or working class representatives, religious minorities, they tend to be mainly men who are elected to those spots. Just to give an example, on this slide, you can see some data from a study of 81 countries, which looks at the relative proportions of majority and minority men and women in the population compared to the legislature. So I think you can immediately see that men from majority ethnic groups are vastly overrepresented in legislatures compared to their share of the population by a factor of around 2 to 1, right? So they are about 39% of the population in these 81 countries, but they're 72% of the representatives, right? Um, we see that minority men are represented more or less proportionally, right? They're about 11% of the population, 11% of representatives. Majority women are underrepresented, but minority women are the most underrepresented of all. In this case, by a factor of about 5 to 1, right? If they're about 11% of the population, they're only 2% of representatives. So we see the same pattern when we look at disability, age, class, etc. So my argument is that to achieve gender parity, we need to make sure that we take these other forms of inequality into account as well, really to make sure the parity is actually for all women, right? Not just a privileged few. Okay, so then turning to barriers to parity, we can find them in our patriarchal systems that divide the world into two spheres, right? There's the public sphere and the private sphere. The public sphere of the public sphere of politics and the economy tends to be seen as a men's space, while the private sphere of home and the family tends to be seen as a space for women. And this divide has implications for women who want to participate in politics because that is in the public sphere, right? A space where they allegedly do not belong. And this generates three dynamics that contribute to the exclusion of women in politics. Right? Due to dynamics of socialization, women tend not to come forward as candidates because they've been taught that politics is not for them. Even when they have the same qualifications as men, they believe that they're not qualified to run for office. And even if they think they are qualified, they would never actually run, right? Whereas men are much more likely to think they're qualified, but even if they don't feel they're qualified, they say they would run for office, right? So there's something that socializes women to sort of step back and men to step forward as political candidates. Due to discrimination, the second dynamic, elites show bias against women candidates, refusing to nominate and support them. And when they're forced to do so, right, in the case of gender quotas, they often try to find all sorts of ways to avoid fully implementing these measures. And finally, when women do beat the odds to enter politics, they often experience a strong reaction against their participation. And this backlash uses various forms of violence, harassment, and abuse to try to push women back out of politics, or at least to make them less effective while they're there. So if we want to make progress towards equal representation, we need to recognize these three sets of barriers and focus on finding strategies that help us combat all three. And in the book, I give a wide range of examples of how to do that, looking at each set of barriers in turn. So I'll just turn to that. I'm calling it the Parity Toolkit. So I'm going to focus just on 4 of the strategies that I talk about in relation to these 3 dynamics of exclusion. So we start with strategies to combat socialization. One of the major strategies used globally are candidate trainings, and that is especially the case in context where there is concern or hesitance to use gender quotas. So one example we have is the Ready to Run campaign, which is organized by the Center for American Women and Politics here at Rutgers. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand about these trainings is that they are not about making women more qualified to run. Right? Women are already equally or more qualified than the men in public office. But trainings can be very helpful to equip women with running more effective campaigns. So at Ready to Run, they teach the participants things like how to build a campaign team, how to create a campaign message, how to gain your party's support, right? Like working inside the party structure, and how to raise money for their campaigns. And one of the things I think is really great about Ready to Run is that they also build in this focus on diversity. They have a sort of extra half day of trainings to Ready to Run, where they focus on the specific barriers to African American women, Latina women, and Asian American women. So try to kind of capture that diversity aspect of women's participation. A second example that I think combats socialization involves campaign fundraising. Um, Many parts of the world, it's very expensive to run for political office. And women, tend to have less disposable income than men to begin with, but they can also face greater challenges in asking for and receiving money from others. So just an example of a successful intervention is a group called Emily's List, which is again in the US, which was established in 1985 to raise money for pro-choice Democratic women candidates. And the model is to bundle a lot of small contributions to make early investments in women's campaigns, which is to make their campaigns seem more viable, right? And the idea is that that will then convince other people to follow by making their own donations. And this model has proven extremely effective in electing Democratic women to office at all levels of politics. And this was some data that I elaborated based on data from my colleagues at the Center for American Women in Politics. You can see in 1985, there were roughly the same number of Democratic and Republican women in the US Congress. But then after Emily's List is introduced, there's a huge divergence, right? The line for Republicans is pretty much flat, right? There's a few ups and downs, right? But it's pretty low. Whereas the Democrats have gone, massively upwards. And in fact, if you look at the share of women amongst Democratic representatives in the national level, at the state level, they're pretty close to parity, actually, in terms of representation, right? They have roughly the same numbers of women and men, maybe a fewer women, like in the 40%. But the real problem is Republican women have not had the same experience, the same increases in access and participation. Okay, then if we look at strategies to combat discrimination, the main strategy you could probably guess is gender quotas. I've already mentioned that. By my latest count, around 140 countries now have some type of gender quota in place. And it's just a map from International IDEA. And you can see that these are all the countries that have some form of gender quota in place. But all these measures are not the same, right? They take three main forms. The first are reserve seats, which set aside places for women in elected assemblies. They usually involve changes to constitutions, to electoral laws, and they tend to be found across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And because they reserve seats for women, they guarantee that at least that number of women will be elected, right? So they kind of guarantee the outcomes at least, but women can also be elected above and beyond that as well. Party quotas is a second type. They involve pledges by individual political parties to nominate a certain percentage of women among their candidates. And this usually involves changes to party statutes, party documents. And they were first introduced in the 1970s by left-wing parties in Western Europe, but they've now spread to parties across the political spectrum and to different regions around the world. What makes party quotas distinct from reserve seats, in addition to being at the party level, is that they apply to the candidates who are nominated, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be translated into the candidates who are ultimately elected. And that's a place where if parties are less committed to actually nominating women and putting them in winnable spots, we see a difference between the percentage of the quota and the percentage of women elected. Legislative quotas, finally, are the third type. They're more recent in nature, 1990s and onwards, and they mandate that all political parties must nominate a certain share of women. So this usually involves a change to the electoral law, and these are measures that are found across Latin America. Almost every Latin American country has a gender quota law. And actually, that's the reason why they stand out amongst the other regions in terms of increases in women's representation. But these are also quite common in countries in post-conflict contexts as a result of the impact of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So, like reserved seats, they apply at the national level, but like party quotas, they apply just to the nomination of candidates, which is why they have these varied effects. Okay, finally, oops. Um, Strategies to combat backlash include introducing legislation to tackle the problem of violence against women in politics. So you can see here from this table that this is a strategy very common across Latin America, where there has also been extensive attention to rising attacks against women engaged in politics. And I think, it's very much linked to the fact that they're the region that's made the most progress, right? Is the one that has really opened up our attention to this issue globally. So the violence against women in politics is it's not just about physical attacks, right? It involves a whole range, a whole continuum of possible forms of violence. So it can include physical assaults, but also online abuse, harassment, sexual harassment, vandalism, like property damage against women's campaign offices or campaign posters. And it can also include things like fake news and other forms of gender disinformation, right? So like, photoshopped images, fake videos that are women doing and saying things in those that they actually are not real, often sexualizing them to humiliate women and to get them to step down as candidates. And this is also a problem in the United States with rising partisan polarization. Our politics has gotten really nasty in recent years. So it's also an issue that it's not a law, but like the introduction of resolutions that highlight the fact that this is a problem globally as well as in the US. And I think what's really interesting is the promoters of this particular House resolution in the US, all of them, the main signers are all Democratic women of color. So they are amongst the Muslim women elected, the first Muslim women elected to Congress. You have an African American woman, you have a Latino woman, and then they're joined by Jackie Spear, who is a woman who's been in Congress for a long time, but she worked on the Me Too Congress bill to combat sexual harassment in the U.S. Congress. So it's an issue that's important to her for many, many decades. But her interest got into that when she was a young woman in politics, when she was a staffer and she was facing sexual harassment as a young woman as well. So there's also that intersectional component to her commitment to this issue. Okay, so I'll just end with a few reflections on the importance of fighting for gender parity in an age of backlash. We are living in a time of unprecedented increases in women's representation. There have never been more women in parliament, women in cabinets, and women in national leadership positions. But at the same time, because of patriarchy, its ongoing hold on our societies, women's leadership continues to be challenged. And this is coming at the same time as we're seeing a decline in democracy and a growth in inequality around the world. I don't think that parity is the only answer, but I would argue that it's a crucial one for moving forward. And at a time of backlash, in fact, I would say the parity is needed more than ever. And I hope that you'll join me in trying to make this happen. Thank you. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Obviously, much of what you covered resonated with so many of us, especially the way you just ended by talking about the fact that, the challenges to women's leadership are very much linked to the decline of democracy that we're seeing across the globe here in US as well as in many other parts, particularly as Walum is concerned with across the Muslim world. I also really appreciated the toolkit. I think those are really important factors for us to sort of keep keep an eye on, yes, gender quotas are not perfect, yet they are a tool. We have so much knowledge on how to design gender quotas that could be more effective, that allow that sort of that diversity of access to power and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm going to give the floor first and foremost to some of our Bangladeshi audiences, just because I feel like it would be good to get sort of the first set of questions from them, and then open it up to others. So if you don't mind, please raising your hand. And I do know that my colleagues are also going to help us with keeping through on the chat as well. Okay. Um, from our Bangladeshi colleagues, who would like to ask the first question? Sumaya, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi. Thank you. That was a wonderful description, and I think I really appreciate how the visuals really showcase data, and I think that's really important. And to sort of before I ask my question, I think I'd like to sort of reflect on the current political sphere and of the election so that I have some sort of background information to sort of add to. So currently, I think after 25 years, when we have this new form of election, we've noticed a drop of participation of women, and this drop is not voluntary, it's more systemic. We find that out of 300 elected members of parliament, we have 7 women and 50 members, and amongst 50 members, we have only 3 politicians. We also find that during the July movement, we had a huge surge number of women resilience, which were then after, during the time of interim government, systematically went really quiet. And out of 100 constituencies or where women candidates will contest, but the ongoing BNP and Jamaat-e-Islami sort of opposed that idea. Interestingly, the labor participation in Bangladesh is over 44%. We have RMG workers, we have women working in the indigenous communities, in the hill tracts and tea plantation communities as well. My question to you would be, because we have what we've noticed when Dr. Mona and Dr. Homa also joined us, and they can also vouch for this, we have a lot of huge numbers of ongoing grassroots feminist organizations coming across. How can we, as feminists and young feminists that are sort of ongoing and currently working on the field, change narratives in terms of policy making? We keep talking about policy making and we keep introducing more letters to the parliament, but they never really go through, or sometimes they're sort of obstructed. And I think we're having this problem because it is often delayed and oftentimes very much silenced. Parity is an idea that would be very utopian for us as of currently, because there's just so many things that are supposed to be changed before that. What can we do as academics and grassroots feminists to sort of sweep in and join that space? Because I think for now there's an obstruction that's working around this work. Again, thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you said a lot of really interesting things, and I think this is really at the heart of the issue, right? Like how do we go forward? How do we start doing this? So one of the things that came up in my violence book again and again was the importance of awareness raising and talking about the issue. And I talked about in that book about how like violence against women in politics, the concept, it really like was continuation of a long-standing feminist strategy, a women's movement strategy, which is to name a problem, right? Like the concept of sexual harassment, like has always existed. It's only in the last few decades we have a word for it, right? And we can identify it, right? Before it was like, and this is true for women and for other marginalized groups, we lack a language sometimes to explain our experiences. And so I feel like awareness raising is like the first thing, right? If it's not if women's exclusion is normalized, right, then we do what we can to denormalize that exclusion to say that's not right. and there's ways to do that through, public platforms, writing in newspapers, speaking to journalists. I always agree to talk to journalists on the issue of violence because I'm glad when they talk about it because they have a bigger, another platform that I don't have to bring the issue. And so I think that kind of talking about it is really important. And I think that's something that women's movements can do because that's and academics can do, right? We have a platform to try to get our voice out. A second thing that I would say, and this is what I have been doing in this book and my work more generally, is to identify the myths and respond with the realities. One of the issues that has come up so much in my work in academia and in practice is this question about, do quotas promote unqualified women, right? Do they undermine merit? And all of the data we have shows that they don't. Actually, they bring in really qualified women, but having a quota actually increases the quality of the men we have too, right? So it actually leads to greater quality of representatives more generally, right? So it's like trying to think about how to kind of correct people's information. Another one is, women often get blamed for like, well, we'd have more women in politics if women would just vote for them, right? So then it blames women for not running and then for not getting voter support. Actually, it's because men don't vote for women, right? That's actually like the empirical fact of it, right? And it's because parties don't nominate women, right? Like if I'm just getting a bunch of men candidates, I don't have the choice to vote for women. Like they're not giving me that choice, right? So I think like working on the myths and realities component of that is really, really important. And just the last thing, I see there are other questions coming, but this idea about getting parity, it's like the question is like, do we have all these changes and then we get parity, or should we focus on getting parity and then it's going to help us get those other changes? And for me, because I think about action, I think we should be mobilizing for parity, and then using that as a starting point, right? And trying to change, not waiting for the world to change, but changing it ourselves. So thank you.
Thank you. Arzu?
Hi, it was really nice to hear from you, Dr. Krook. My quick question, like before Sumaya added the background, so it will be easier for me to, ask the question, as she has mentioned that only seven, women are being elected in our national parliament elections, and surprisingly, all of them are from political family background. So my question is like, how can we increase the participation of other women in politics, to ensure parity? And as they are from political background, it's really tough for maintain the ratio or quota. So how can we ensure that as well? That's my question.
Mhm. That's also a very good question. I think when we know, especially about women national leaders, is that they are much more likely than men to come from a political family. In the sense that men have many different ways that they can become a leader, right? But for women, that political family component is like one of a really important one, more important. Um, and I think that is it's a real challenge, right? And it's not just like in Bangladesh, but it's also like a problem in countries like Ireland. Most people come from a political family, um, and I think that um, on the one hand, right, like it's good because we have at least some women, right, coming through. But I think in terms of trying to diversify it, I think it's about again like working on this idea of like, well, who's qualified to run, right? Like who has important ideas that we can support them, right? And I think this is also where quotas become important. Like one of the I think the forms of resistance to quotas is that they just nominate like the women they know who are their relatives. Like we saw that in Sweden and when quotas first came, formal quotas came in the 1990s. A lot of the women came from political families, but over time it opened up. It was a signal, right, that politics was more open, and then more women started to think about running for office. Like they didn't have to be from a political family, and so I feel like over time, ideally, there's work that we can try to do to open up the path to other women. But I feel like that's very difficult in general. So I don't know if there's like a magical formula, but I think, we can hope by kind of highlighting all these other ways that women, they're, I don't know, a trade union leader, or they are, a top businesswoman, or something, somebody who has some resources, or they're, really important activist and getting, mobilizing for some change, right? If we can try to support those women as well, I think we can diversify the numbers, the kinds of women who come into public office.
Thank you. I really appreciate that nuance that you brought in, that like, there's many men that also enter politics through family relationships, but women, they're the ones that scrutinize it a lot more. And it's also great to see that this is not just a Bangladeshi or an Asian problem. We do
Yeah.
see this, also taking place in a place like Sweden. Warda, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Dr. Mona Lena Krook, thank you so much for this presentation and for writing the book and the organization, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, for hosting this. It's really very timely for us in Bangladesh to be talking about this, because I think already Sumaya has said a little bit that we had a 15-year regime where we don't really have a very good democratic system, and now finally on February 12th, 2026, we have a election where there was a what shall I say, it was relatively free and fair. People could participate freely. So I just want to put in two questions. And while I was following Dr. Crook's presentation, I did not hear her mention this. So this is something that we are advocating for in Bangladesh. In the last, before the last election, from the women's activist groups, one of our very strong recommendation to the interim government was to sort of identify constituencies, within, we have 300 constituencies, and we wanted another additional 100 constituencies where they would hold direct elections, women candidates against women candidates. Is that, was that clear the way I explained it?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a model that we're really strongly advocating now in Bangladesh, from the women's activists, feminist groups here. Because that seems like a fair system where women can compete against other women. Because as Sumaya had already explained, that in Bangladesh, the political scene is marked by, there's a lot of political families who have a long tradition of being in politics, and it's difficult for others to come in. And there's a lot of influence of the muscle power. And violence is part of it. So it's very difficult and to some extent not practical for a man to compete against a woman. Sorry, a woman to compete against a male candidate and expect like a level playing field, there. So that's a question that I have. That do you know of any other countries where this is practiced, or can you give us say some ideas on how maybe we could pursue that more strongly? And the other question that I had is that I think you really touched a very important point there when you said in your toolkit that campaign funding, strategies for campaign funding, that is so important for women, because when it comes, it's such a practical challenge that when women candidates are trying to gather campaign funding, it's extremely challenging. And one of our advocacies was also for allocating state funding to promote these women, because there are these pressure groups and you have to go to them, these private sector technocrats and private business leads. And when when you kind of try to secure fund from them, you also make a commitment for later on to give them certain kind of advantages. And it's once again, it's not a very what shall I say, it's not a very clean mechanism. So we were thinking that initially that women could maybe avail state funding for running campaigns, and that would, I think, really what shall I say, like really put a lot of force into the future elections. So that's also another thing that I wanted to hear your thoughts on, if you have any experience of any other countries doing that kind of
Mhm.
practice. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So the question about constituencies like direct elections, we see that reserve seats, which I mentioned before, they actually are designed and implemented in different ways. So there are some cases, which I understand was the case in Bangladesh, where or even it might be like Tanzania, where like they have the election, and then depending on how many votes the parties got, they get to fill a certain number of reserved seats for women. But there are other cases where women run directly for those seats. Okay, but there's a few ways to do it. So one is like India, where they do this at the local level, but they have all the districts, the normal districts, and they do a lottery, and they choose, one third or one half, depending on the state, of those districts are only for women. So only women can run for those. But then they do another lottery the next time, and so it may or may not be the same seat, right? Sometimes it's reserved for women, sometimes it's not. But what's very interesting is there's some evidence that like when it's reserved for women and then it's de-reserved because it's now no longer chosen, women are much more likely to run as open candidates in those seats, right? Because they have the political experience and now they have the visibility because they've held that position. Okay, so that's one model. But then you have countries like Kenya, where or Uganda historically, where they have women's districts, but women's districts like they overlap the existing districts. So there might be like, I don't know, like 5 open seats, and then there's a one woman's district on top. So you elect those 5 seats directly, but you also vote for the women directly, right? And so that guarantees there's at least one woman in the mix. But what is very tricky about that is that the woman is like sharing those constituencies with the other people who are elected, and sometimes that creates some tensions, right? Because it's like, well, who's the representative? And there are also inequalities. So every representative who's in the open seats, they get something called a constituency development fund to help, invest in their communities. But the reserved seat women don't. So they have fewer resources than the others. So you already have these conflicts, but then you have inequality of resources, and so that has been a long-standing discussion in Kenya about how to fix that. So there's different models, I guess is what I'm saying, in different places. Historically, also like countries like Jordan and Afghanistan, they have, or even in Taiwan, when they do their reserve seats, so like I don't know, 10 seats are reserved for women, and 8 women win the seats directly. Then they take the 2 women who had the best results but didn't win a seat, and they get added, right? So it's called the best loser system. They even use it in like some Pacific Island countries too, like Samoa, where you give women the chance to win directly, but if they don't, then you add the seats on top of that. And what was so fascinating about some data from Taiwan was when, the men who had to be kicked out, right? It turns out that the women were much more qualified. The losing women who came in actually had more qualifications than the men. So it wasn't about bringing down the quality. It actually contributed to the quality as well. So that was a long answer to that one. But on the funding issue, that's slightly less developed, and we know less about it. But in the book, I actually have some charts that look some tables that tell you about different places where their political funding is built into the election law, sometimes into the quota law, and sometimes not. So sometimes there are like sanctions. In France, if you don't fulfill the quota, you have to pay a penalty. But there's other countries where they give you an incentive. So if you elect at least 30% women, right, you get like a certain bonus in your funding. And that's designed in different ways in terms of different pots of money that gets used. So it's supposed to, so there are sanctions, but there are also incentives to try to get parties to invest in women candidates and in their success, right? So it's not just that you nominated all these women, but you actually got them into office. There's only one country where there was only that didn't have a quota in a report that I did recently for the OSCE at Georgia, and it wasn't effective on its own, right? It seemed to work best with a gender quota, as we saw in some of the other countries in that region. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were some really good points, particularly with regards to if I could just like add like 30 seconds to this in the sense
Yeah.
when it comes to the design of gender quotas, it's so important to have sort of the women's movement and the feminist movement have an input on their design because they actually are the best to know like what the communities need. Rarely does that happen, right? Where the feminist movement is very much sort of integrated within that process. And then the other thing with some of the reserve seats is that at some point they can actually act as a threshold versus a floor for women being, and entering into so that was definitely the case with Afghanistan, where like outright, at least two women from each province were elected within those positions, and so yeah, so that's again like we need to design them better. So if you don't mind, Mona, I'm going to combine some of the questions. I'm going to give
Yeah,
the floor
sure,
to
sure.
Homa, but just very quickly looking at our Zoom. So I have a question from Dr. Sally Ann Corcoran, which one of her questions is, to what extent do you think women's political participation changes perspectives in society on women's equality, which would in turn decrease violence against women, or what actions can we take in and can governments take to dismantle patriarchy? And then, I can definitely give the floor as well. And then the other point is I may want to ask someone who served in the Afghanistan parliament with regards to their quota. So if you don't mind, Sabrina Sagheb, maybe I can give you the floor after Homa gets to speak because I think it would be really nice to also sort of have that perspective as well. Okay, go ahead, Homa John.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think the question of the broader impact of quotas, I think is a very important one, right? Because it's not just about like within the political structures, but how is it affecting, society more generally. And so we are just starting to kind of get evidence about that. But I think, like there's a lot of research on India because of this, like the randomness of like choosing the reserve seats, and you can actually see like what's the impact if you have never had a woman there, if you had them once, if you had them twice, over time. And what that research is showing is that being exposed to women leaders is changing how people think about leadership, right? If it's never been reserved, it's been reserved once, they think men are always better leaders. But once they have seen it twice, they think women make equally good leaders. And the change is biggest amongst men, actually, who change their minds. The same kinds of studies show that it changes parents' aspirations for their daughters. They're more likely to keep them in school. And the girls themselves say they're more likely in having a career in the future to continue their education. And you also have cases where if there's a woman mayor because of the quota system, the women in the village are more likely to attend and speak at village meetings. So there's something I think that's going on, like above and beyond, like the policy impact, but the presence is very important. But we also see in countries like Rwanda, my colleague Jenny did some research with just like ordinary women. She's an anthropologist. And she found that it really did change how women thought about themselves and what they could do. But it also led to some backlash. There were tensions with their brothers and their husbands because, especially their brothers, because there were changes then in like inheritance laws and other things, right? So it actually increased some violence against women, right? Or husbands are like, who do you think you are? You are um, even the women who were in holding office themselves, for example, at the local level. So I think there's a lot, but that also suggests that there's change happening if there's also the pushback, right? And so I think some really interesting things happening were evidence, right, to show that it is making a bigger difference. But it might be increasing some of that violence, unfortunately, as well.
Perfect. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask Homa to speak and then Nemat to speak and then give you the floor, Mona.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mona. This was very interesting to listen to the different perspective. But I have one comment for the Bangladesh situation. One of the issue is that population of Bangladesh since 1991, when I started to follow the politics in Bangladesh, has doubled. Why can't we say, okay, we now have to have more seats? It's a lot easier than men feel you're taking away seats from them to give to women. So that tension, that's one of the other issues. The the other thing that, because of course Iran is in a very peculiar situation right now, but we are expecting some kind of major changes. So we have been discussing about women and politics. And one of the things we have come up with is that all the district, of course, in Iran doesn't have a very formal political party system, so it's easier. But even when there are political system, why can't we say for every constituency you have a man and a woman, and each constituency can choose one woman, one man, and that also would solve some of the problem of ethnic and minority, because some of the regions, for instance, they have more of ethnic minority or religious minority than others. So not that solves the whole question, but that has been some of the debates we have had, and I would like to get your view on that, as we are going through discussion on that question. And my last question really is, okay, I remember the time men resisted quota system or even debate or suggestion. I'm old enough to remember all those debates since I was a student, but now we see that kind of resent. They have accepted the quotas, but parity is like, don't touch it. Right? And I wanted to see what are the advantages for countries that want to push for more women to actually debate on parity, because the kind of arguments you can make for parity is different than what you make for gender quota in many ways. So I don't know. I always feel going for parity, it makes more impact than quota at this stage. But I would love to know your perspective on it.
Thank you. And Nemat, if I can have you also. Sorry, Mona, I know the question's
Fine, that's fine. Yeah, looking at the
and
time.
yeah, and Nemat, if you can just keep your comments to just like a maximum a minute, please. Thank you. Could you unmute? You are muted. I'm asking you to unmute if you could.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, I was trying to get to open the video just to say hello, because it's too early. I am in the extreme west coast of the United States. So anyway, two or three short questions. One, sorry I missed the beginning, Mona, but I want to congratulate you on the book. And my comment is, I am looking forward to reading the book, but when you say for change, exactly how deep the change are you looking into? Maybe you have it in the book, but maybe you can briefly tell us now. The second question, I noticed that only Tunisia was listed under the resolution 1151. Could you tell me exactly, is that a ramification of that law by Tunisia or what? And the last question, is there any new representation of Syrian women under the WLUML? Thank you.
Okay.
I need to mute myself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next, maybe I'll just start with the question of the title. So elect women for a change. It actually, I mean, it has two meanings. It's meant to be ambiguous. So on the one hand, it's for a change, like to do something different than what we've done before, right? But it's also about making the case that having more women, it has an impact on politics and society. But in the chapter I have on the benefits of parity, I really want to emphasize that it's not like, we have more women and then like everything is wonderful, it's fixed, right? It's that it's not a guarantee that the world is going to change in these positive ways, but if we want those positive things, we need parity to get there, right? Like that we need women to be part of that solution. And so it's meant to be both about making an impact, but also to do something differently. On the actual, let's say the technicalities of some of these quotas. So in Tunisia is interesting because it's the first country in the Arab world that had gender parity, right? It came out of the Arab Spring, and it required, they had a list system. So you had to alternate between men and women on the list all the way down, 50-50. But what happened with that in the early elections was that there's so many parties that most parties won one seat. And who did they put at the top of the list? It was a man. But then they had a movement to have not just what they call vertical parity down the list, but horizontal parity, which was every list head, if they have multiple lists in many districts, half of their lists had to be led by women and half of them had to be led by a man. At the local level, that got to almost perfect parity. It was like 48 or 49% women elected. So I think it's a great case for thinking about, quota design, but also the parity is not foreign, right? To women in Muslim countries. I think this is something can be done, and we have an example. However, unfortunately, it's also a sad case because they changed the electoral law, and when they changed the electoral law, it got rid of the quota. So it doesn't have parity anymore. They used to also have a quota for young people, and that also got led. But what was interesting is the combination of quota for young people and a quota for women is that it led to the election of a lot of young women to parliament, which is actually most of the young MPs were women, actually. So I know that's very interesting case to look at in the region. On the question of Bangladesh, as I understand, it's like the seats are added on, right? So they went from 15 to 30 to 45, right, over the time. So it's a case, I think it's really interesting that highlights, I think, one of the core problems here, which is that in order to increase the share of women, we have to decrease the share of men. And men don't want to leave, right? This is the core problem. It's a zero-sum game, right? Someone has to win, so someone has to lose, right? And so in some countries, you try to add on because the men don't have to leave, but you can increase, spaces for women. And so I think this is a real issue. But I think one of the ways around it is to really try to emphasize the positive sum, to say that having more women benefits everybody, right? It's not just about these men who have to leave. Yes, they do have to leave, but actually society is going to benefit. Politics is going to benefit from it. And I think that's where you start to see arguments like in international discussions that parity is not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, right? It's going to help us get more development, more democracy, and things that are good for society as a whole. It is very hard for those guys to leave their seats, right? They want to keep them. On the 1-in-1, there was a really interesting example in Scotland when they created a new parliament. So they had a combination of electoral systems, but one part was where you elect one person per district. And the Labour Party decided to pair or twin constituencies that were equally winnable and equally losable. They put a man in one and a woman in the other. So they ended up electing 50% women and men in that part. And then their list, they had the alternation between men and women. So that was actually very interesting. And that was just done in the first election to the Scottish Parliament. But I think it's sort of this example of like how you make sure that you still have elections, but you can bring both a man and a woman together. On the issue of like other quotas too, I just mentioned that we know that if there's a quota for women and quotas for ethnic minorities, it tends to be women from the ethnic majority and men from the ethnic minority who get elected. But some quotas now are being designed to be intersectional. So there's more and more countries adopting quotas for young people that include gender parity within it. Right. So if you have like 30 seats reserved for young people, it needs to be 15 women, 15 men. If it's quotas for people with disabilities, there's 2 seats and one has to be a woman, one has to be a man. So that's some ways that parity is being built into other kinds of quotas. Um, and just the last thing I'll say about parity, like being difficult or harder to get, a very interesting conversation with a colleague of mine in Japan who said that when her group was trying to get a quota, asking for 30%, everyone said, well, why 30%? That just seems so um, random, right? But she's like, okay, what about 50-50? And I'm like, well, okay, we can see the logic of 50-50 because there's half women and half men, right? Like, and so they were more willing to accept that. That also happened in France. I mentioned as the first country in the world to have a parity law. They had a 25% law in local elections. It was declared unconstitutional. So the way they did it was to reform the Constitution for parity, and then it became like 50-50, right? So they rejected the smaller quota, then they had to get the bigger one. It was harder to argue against it. So I think there's interesting ways in which parity actually maybe can get us further than we think because of the nature of the 50-50 itself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I think, Nemat, with response to your question on, what is women living under Muslim laws doing with other countries, particularly with Arab countries and all of that. I think Mona's talk just now really helped us understand why this transnational and this comparative, perspective is really, really important because, we see how there's models that work and there's models that are imperfect and like how do we like borrow from each other and get inspiration from each other on some of the best strategies in particularly with regards to let's say quota design or even like campaign financing laws and so on and so forth. So I think that in itself has been really, really significant. So women living under Muslim laws obviously has been about empowering women and of course gender equality, particularly within the political sphere. One thing that we've noticed, and I think this is why we're being extremely intentional about this, is that at moments of transition, right, when you have a country transitioning, for instance, when the time comes for a new constitution to be written, when it comes to, bringing about, a new political system and so on and so forth, or even during moments of crises and conflict where you see sort of a reshuffling, like a radical reshuffling of things are happening. This is when we call like opportunities that present themselves. And it's really important for feminists, particularly women's rights advocates, to be really prepared to take advantage of these because these things happen, very quickly and the opportunities really present themselves. And then there's so many different actors that try to enter the scene and sort of like hijack them to their own benefit. So I think that's been one of our main intentions to be really prepared and mobilized to be able to sort of not only borrow from one another, but also create this space of exchange of knowledge, exchange of experiences, and exchange of resources. So across the Muslim world, we're actually seeing a number of countries that are transitioning or that they're about to transition. Bangladesh, of course, is one that ever since the 2024 uprisings, where you saw the downfall of a women authoritarian figure, there was this transition. Obviously, the elections were just held 2 weeks ago, and there's, now hopefully the constitution is going to be debated and discussed. We're not so sure about that. But nonetheless, we feel that the experiences of Bangladesh, especially, the rise of, the religious political movements and parties and their discourses and all of that, those are going to be quite transferable to a case like Afghanistan, which eventually would transition. Those will be transferable to a case of Iran. So this is where a lot of our work has been towards creating these toolkits, creating these spaces to be able to particularly talk about women's political power and gender equality during moments of transition and conflict. I know we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to give the floor to Homa or to whoever else that wants to.
Well, why don't we hear from Mona?
Yes. Do you have any thoughts on, moments of transition and conflict in
I
general?
just thought in the moment of transition it is the moment that's obviously this existing social contract has not worked. And so the minorities, women, those who were excluded can raise their voices, and there are people who can hear them because what was there was not heard. So there's, in that way, the moment of transition are very historical for women and for minorities that have been excluded. So they can, but they have to be prepared. They can't wait until the moment of transition and then they want to get together. They have to have this kind of talks. And the role of Bloom is to provide that kind of background, to give the example, to share example. We build the solidarity based on sharing experiences, where it worked, where it didn't work, where the culture came, when the religion came. And also in terms of situation of like when we talk with my colleagues in other non-Muslim contexts, I say, well, you have the men opposition to you, but we have men, and plus also they bring God as their support. We have to fight two places to show that these are not God-given or biological or other these things built. These are, you can't build those overnight. You have to build it, as Mona was explaining. You get ready for this transition long before, and you develop the argument. You try to change the mindset, and then at the moment of transition is where you can come in more decisively. Thank you, Mona.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we are out of time officially, so I just wanted to thank everyone here. Yes, this video, this recording will be posted on our social media, on Volume's page. Please, please, please follow us. And Mona, thanks again for joining us today and for this wonderful, wonderful, informative talk.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.